Hi, I'm Brandon Dawson. I use he, they pronouns. I'm based in Dallas, Texas. I am the Senior Director of State Strategy and Capacity Building with Just Solutions. If you're not familiar with Just Solutions, we're a national organization working on climate justice issues. We work to support partners in the states to make sure that they have the resources, tools, and knowledge to make sure that their solutions are transferable to policy and law in any way, shape, or form. As I mentioned, this is part of the Energy Affordability Spotlight series that looks at specific issues in energy affordability. We held one previously on public banking. Um, this one is on polling and narrative, and the next one, which we'll announce next month, will likely be on some housing issues. And so we're excited to bring that to the forefront. We'll first start off with some panelist presentations. You'll hear from Environmental Polling Consortium Coalition, David Gold and Leah Zamesnik, who are some great partners for Just Solutions. They have run a number of polling related to energy affordability, but also environmental issues writ large, but they also compile a lot. If you're not on their data and fund or in polling kind of compilation emails that they send out every week, they're super helpful, and I highly suggest that get on that list. And then you'll also hear from Just Solutions fellows ourselves, Deric Gruen, who is our narrative expert, and we'll talk a little bit about how to reframe the narrative to issues that make sense of the work you're doing, and also give you an example of how to do that. Lastly, I'll talk about a mini case study that brings all this together and some work that we did in Michigan specifically, and then we'll have a Q&A. I will note as well that this is being recorded, as I'm sure you can tell. And so if you have any automated transcribers or anything, please turn those off. This will be sent out at the end of in a formal email at the end of the webinar as well. So yeah, next slide. Perfect. So today you should leave with a couple of things. One, a clear read on public opinion landscape on energy affordability from Leah and David, which will be great. Next, you should get some practical strategies for crafting and reframing narratives that Deric will really help you orient yourselves around. And then lastly, you should have some idea about how to use polling, narrative, or comms in your affordability campaigns in a way that is both equitable and also proactive. That proactive piece is really important. A lot of energy affordability work that is taking place right now is coming from a reactive lens, understandably so. However, how do you get in front of that? That's something that we really want to make sure you're leaving with today, and we're going to talk about. So with that, I will pass it over to Leah and David to kick us off and kind of context setting of where we are in energy affordability.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon and the whole Just Solutions team for having us. Always great to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And yeah, thanks again for having me. David Gold, Director of the Environmental Polling Consortium. And as Brandon previewed, we're going to go through the latest polling on energy affordability, how the public is feeling about it, and how we as advocates can meet this moment. So, for a little bit of intro, if you're not familiar with us, the Environmental Polling Consortium, or EPC, is a movement support organization that works to coordinate and share and execute public opinion research in order to shift people's attitudes and advance our shared advocacy goals. We do this in a few ways by collecting and distributing and interpreting public opinion research about environmental issues. We work to make this research more accessible and to democratize data across the environmental movement so folks can run more data-driven and evidence-backed campaigns. And you can learn more about us on our website, and my colleague Leah will also, and already has been dropping some links to our resources in the chat. And to preview some of the key takeaways I'll be talking about here. So first, the cost of living remains the clear number one issue for voters, and energy affordability is a big part of that. We see in the data that utility costs are not being felt quite as acutely as other things like gas prices or the cost of groceries, but across the board, we see the vast majority of Americans saying that their utility bills are continuing to go up. Second important thing, no, voters are not blaming increasing utility bills on clean energy. We have seen Trump and other conservative leaders try to pin this all on so-called green energy mandates, Biden energy policy, etc. That argument is simply falling flat. So voters blame a lot of different things for rising energy prices. They blame Trump, they blame the war in Iran, they blame the oil and gas industry, they blame data centers, and they blame utility companies. Very, very few blame clean energy. In fact, voters are more open than ever before to messaging about clean energy as a solution to the problem of rising energy bills. And third, we find that effective messaging on this topic meets Americans where they are. So there is a populist element that is helpful in messaging on this topic. So demanding accountability for villains like utility companies, like fossil fuel companies, and also an important education component where we basically need to consistently assert that expanding clean energy will make energy more affordable. Voters are, again, more inclined to believe that than ever before. We need to keep making that connection between clean energy and affordability. So getting into the data, and first just taking a broad view of the affordability landscape. So cost of living is the number one issue priority for Americans by a wide margin. Probably not a surprise to folks here. Doesn't matter if people are Democrats, Independents, Republicans, across the board, affordability is Americans' number one priority, and it has been this way going all the way back to the inflation brought on by COVID more than 5 years ago. And I should state here, all the data we'll be talking about comes from national polling of either voters or U.S. adults, with one or two exceptions that I'll point out. When you ask voters about specific costs or specific cost categories, voters widely agree that the cost of nearly everything is going up. So, for example, 79% of voters say that the cost of utility specifically is going up, including 37% who say that utility costs are going up a lot. Voters don't report that their utility costs are rising quite as fast as the cost of gas or the cost of groceries, but they do say that the cost of utilities is going up at about the same rate as the overall cost of living. And about 80% of voters agree that their cost in general, the overall cost of living, is going up. And in terms of blame for the problem of energy prices specifically, this is a fluid situation. So this chart is comparing levels of blame for rising electricity costs last summer and then in May of this year. And we can see that the biggest sources of blame are data centers, the oil and gas industry, the Trump administration Republicans, and the aging electrical grid. About 50% of voters say that each of those things are causing electricity prices to go up a lot. This particular poll didn't ask about utility companies, but in polls that do, they are often in that same top grouping of entities that voters blame the most for rising utility costs. Meanwhile, toward the bottom of the chart, only 29% of voters say that the renewable energy industry is causing electricity costs to go up a lot. Clean energy consistently ranks at or near the bottom in polls that ask voters why they think utility costs are going up. Clean energy is just not a major scapegoat here in the public's eyes. And that gives us basically the room to be more positive in our messaging. So the situation in terms of who people blame for this problem is fluid. So over the past year, there have been very big increases in voters blaming data centers for rising electricity costs. We've seen a huge surge in anger toward data centers in the last 6, 7 months or so. And there's also been increasing blame on Trump and Republicans and on the oil and gas industry over time, likely linked to the war in Iran. And then looking at the blame game another way. So in April, our friends at Climate Power asked voters whether they thought different people and entities are causing utility costs to go up, causing them to go down, or not having an impact. And the three people or entities that voters are most likely to say are causing costs to go up are utility companies, oil and gas companies, and Trump. So for each of those three, 60% of voters or more say that they're causing utility costs to go up. For clean energy companies, they're again toward the bottom of the list, only 37% of voters here believe that clean energy companies are causing costs to go up, and 26% actually believe that clean energy companies are causing costs to go down. That's more than any other item in this list. The voters are inclined to believe that clean energy is actually helping to reduce utility costs. If you look at the breakdown by party, you can see clean energy does pop a bit as a source of blame with Republican voters. About half of Republican voters believe that clean energy is causing costs to go up. That, of course, is the base that Trump is playing to when he says that clean energy is the reason for cost increases. But even Republican voters are actually more likely to blame oil and gas companies for rising utility costs than to blame clean energy companies. So clean energy is just not a central part of the story of energy inflation for any segment of the electorate. And again, that gives us more kind of bandwidth, more room to be proactive in our messaging about clean energy affordability. And we have seen a lot of change in recent years in how people perceive the affordability of clean energy. So for a long, long time, Americans saw clean energy as a nice idea, but too expensive. Now the public sees it as either on par with fossil fuels in terms of costs or actually cheaper. So in this survey by EDF Action in battleground states in January, they asked whether clean energy or gas power plants were better on a variety of different metrics. And by a 20-point margin, voters in battleground states said that they believe that clean energy would do a better job than gas power plants at keeping electricity bills lower. We know from other research that solar in particular is viewed as an affordable energy source whereas the public is a bit less certain about the cost savings of wind energy compared to other energy sources. Solar in general just has a much more positive brand than wind energy, and we see that in the cost debate as well. So moving now into policies and messaging that we've seen in polls. So when you ask voters what kind of policies they think would reduce utility bills, there are actually a lot of things that voters think would be at least somewhat effective. So Third Way asked this question of voters in March, and they found about a dozen policy proposals that majorities of voters thought would bring down utility bill prices. And the top two here are both direct accountability on utility companies. So banning utility company price gouging and capping the fees that utility companies can charge on top of monthly usage. Next on the list, in terms of perceived effectiveness, is expanding the energy supply. So 61% of voters think it would lower utility bills if we build all types of energy, including wind, solar, and fossil fuels like natural gas. A majority, 57%, also believe that it would reduce utility bills if we specifically build more renewable energy like wind and solar. Meanwhile, a lower percentage, 50%, believe that it would lower utility bills if we build more natural gas plants and pipelines specifically. So voters do like that kind of all of the above approach. We've seen this in kind of past energy crises as well. When they're feeling an energy crunch, voters are particularly inclined to say that we should be building more of all types of energy to keep up with increasing demand. We shouldn't be doing anything to limit the supply. But we can see when different energy sources are isolated that voters are, again, more likely to see clean energy expansion as a path to lower costs than to see natural gas expansion as a path to lower costs. And voters do see natural gas as the cheapest fossil fuel. Other ideas that voters think would lower bills include requiring tech companies and data centers to pay more to compensate for the electricity use, requiring utilities to operate as public services that are not allowed to make a profit. So again, two more corporate accountability proposals rising toward the top, which is a common theme in polling on affordability. As well as a variety of other ideas, things like implementing a statewide freeze on utility bill increases, cutting red tape to make it easier to build new energy sources, reducing or eliminating tariffs on energy from Canada, and modernizing the electric grid. So there's a lot actually that voters think could be done here. A lot in that kind of vein of holding corporations more accountable, and also in the vein of expanding the energy supply. Voters see both of these kind of pathways as effective ways to reduce prices for consumers. So in terms of messaging, Climate Power tested a bunch of messages last year to basically increase support for the clean energy transition in light of the affordability crisis. And they found that the two most effective messaging tactics with voters were to educate them about the affordability of clean energy. So just basic education about how clean energy is already cheaper than electricity from gas, and then to call out the greed of utility companies. And we think these messages work very well in combination. So voters We see the rising cost of energy as driven in large part by corporate greed, whether that's from utility companies, whether it's from oil and gas companies, or from tech and data center companies. So it's useful to lean into that populist framing when you're describing the problem. And then we need to keep making the connection between clean energy and affordability, because there is a lack of knowledge there that simple messaging can help to fix. So calling out corporate greed as a problem and presenting clean energy expansion as a solution to high energy costs is kind of an effective 1-2 punch. We've also seen in message testing to build support for renewables that cost-focused messages are now resonating much more than in the past. So for years and years, kind of benefits for public health and future generations consistently rated as the strongest rationales for transition to clean energy in polling and message testing. Now, like in this message testing example, this was done by Good Power this year, cost-focused messages for clean energy are becoming especially persuasive. That's both because voters are so cost-conscious right now, and also because there is increasing public belief in the affordability of clean energy. So in this message test from March, for example, the 3 strongest messages that Good Power tested in support of clean energy were a message about health, and then 2 messages about costs, that one of the best ways to lower families' energy bills is to create more low-cost renewable energy, and that renewable energy means more money in your pocket every month with lower energy bills. So again, just kind of simple messaging, just driving home that connection between clean energy and affordability is shown to be effective. One nice thing about the cost-focused messaging on clean energy also is that it works relatively well across partisan audiences, whereas other messaging themes generally do not. So this is what Good Power found when they observed the strongest and weakest messaging themes with different groups of voters. So with left-leaning voters, climate change was one of the best messaging themes. We see that all the time. But climate ranked as one of the worst messaging lanes with conservative voters. So we know that climate-focused messaging can be quite politically polarizing. That was again the case here. Meanwhile, cost was the most effective messaging lane with conservative respondents. It was the most effective with moderate respondents, and it was also one of the most effective with liberal audiences, along with health and climate. And again, these are all the possible kind of rationales for supporting clean energy. And again, this is a recent trend where we have seen the cost arguments in favor of clean energy becoming much more potent in light of the affordability crisis, both because the public is gradually catching up to the idea that clean energy is oftentimes cheaper to produce than fossil fuel energy, and also because voters are just very eager to hear any solutions to this problem. There's a lot of pessimism in polls right now, basically voters feeling that certainly the Trump administration, but both parties are kind of just failing to address this issue. And so there's a real hunger for solutions, and voters are increasingly believing that clean energy could be one of those solutions to address this problem. So those are the findings we have. I'm now going to pass it to my colleague Leah to explain a little bit more about how you can plug in with our resources, and we'll kick it back to the Just Solutions team.
Great. Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Leah Zamesnik. I'm the partnerships manager at the Environmental Polling Consortium. Just wanted to give you a little bit more background on the resources that we provide after we went over all of this polling. If you're interested into digging into polling more and using it in your own work, we run a polling library on our website. I linked that previously, but I'm going to link the registration to create an account. So to get access to all the polls in our polling resource library, you can create an account. That library is keyword searchable and is there for you to use as a resource. You can search it, see if there's any polling related to your issue areas. There's a lot of documents in that library, so if you need help, please always feel welcome to reach out to David and myself. We'll make sure you have our emails, and we are more than happy to put together a summary of existing data of polling for you. I already linked, but I'll link it again. We also every Friday send out a summary of relevant polls that have come out within the last week. I'm going to put that in the chat right now. This is just a great way to stay up to date on all polling related to climate and the environment. Try not to spam your inbox. We've heard it's really helpful for folks. Also really helpful for us. Let us know what you're working on and we can keep an eye out for new data for you and be in touch. You can think of us as additional staff for you that has our pulse on all the polling that's out there. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out. No question is too small. If after today or after exploring polling a little bit more, you're not seeing any polling that's quite right for what you're working on in your campaigns and you are interested in possibly doing your own polling project, we are here to consult on that and can kind of help you understand what your budget might need to look like, what vendor you might want to use, what questions you should ask, or help you on the back end once you get your data. Again, no questions too small, and we are always here to help.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah and David. That was really great. I really appreciate you all taking the time to give us all of that information. And again, folks, their emails will be and resources and slides will be in an email that'll be sent out after the webinar. So you'll have a lot of ways to get in contact with them. Next, we're going to hear from Deric Gruen, who's one of the senior fellows here at Just Solutions, leading our narrative and strategy change work. So Deric, please take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Brandon. So yeah, excited to help kind of move this conversation forward on a strong evidence base. So thanks, David and Leah. First, though, I want to start with some definitions. We're gonna, if we jump into the first slide, my job here is to give you kind of a framework and a toolkit to be able to take that evidence and help apply it in the work you do to advance change. So that's what we'll be talking about in kind of a high level and also drilling down into more specifics. And just to provide some context to that, we're talking about both narrative change and strategic communications in this section. And I want to make sure we distinguish from those. When we're talking about narrative change, we're talking about this long-term work to change hearts and minds and worldviews really in a way that supports our policy change. And when we're talking about strategic communications, we're talking about really achieving a very specific and targeted goal, which I think probably many of you are involved with, whether it's pathing a policy or moving a piece of work forward. And all these things go together. They're not separate. That's the important thing. And the ideal is we're working, with them in the same, we're working towards narrative change through our strategic communications. An example of this, right, if you're trying to fund a community solar bill or something like that in your state legislature versus you're making the case that solar energy is less expensive, right? That's kind of strategic communications versus narrative change. And going into this, I also want to communicate the context that whether this is your job or not, communications is obviously a critical role for everyone. So some of this may be familiar to some and new to others, but all of us have this critical role in communications to be successful in the work we're doing. And also, I guess, important to this piece is thinking about not getting trapped, right? Sometimes our strategic communications can undermine our narrative change, but we want these things working together to be effective, not only in the short term, but towards this long-term vision of change, which we all know is needed to achieve our objectives. So next slide, please. As we think about narratives then, diving deeper in that kind of long-term change, we're thinking about them as kind of this amorphous collection of many stories and messages that are undergirded by values and a worldview. It's not just one story or message that's a narrative, it's the beliefs, the logic, the assumptions that we use to interpret multiple stories to find patterns and form opinions, right? It's the sense-making process, which really transcends to all of our work. Some narratives might be helpful and some might be harmful to your objectives, but the job is to kind of look for opportunities to understand where narratives are at and be able to intervene in the system to be able to move a narrative towards your objectives. And this graphic is very helpful, I think, from the narrative mission. And we can drop a link to more detail, but it talks about, there's a lot of noise at the surface, right, which are the messages and stories, but those are really driven by the currents underneath, which are values and worldview. And it's really important that we understand what's happening underneath the surface, even as we have to navigate, choppy waters of all the noise that is in our information system right now. So for example, at the surface, we might be talking about, bills are too high, or even affordability more generically, and getting that signal from the polling, right? But underneath, what are, there's some worldviews and values playing around what we believe is fundamental to a dignified life and what our responsibility is to each other to ensure everyone has access to those fundamentals. So as you kind of enter this work, it's important to consider what ideologies, logics, different metaphors are really important in this process, and frames are preconditions for your campaign or policy to be viable. What shared understanding we need to have to be able to move it forward? If someone is a libertarian or an anarchist, you're going to have a hard time convincing them that we need to double down on utility regulation as a strategy to move forward. So part of this is just trying to grapple with what you can change and targeting and narrowing in on that. Next slide speaks specifically to kind of the importance of understanding our audience to that degree. This is an analysis or a way of considering kind of some preconditions that we all come into and opinions from. We don't start from any kind of mythical neutral position that is going to be persuaded by facts and figures. We have predispositions, and we need to be able to consider phenomena like confirmation bias as we start to design our work, whether we're trying to activate people who already have a sense of community and solving problems together, or folks that feel more kind of in this independent place of finding the heroes and the solutions that are going to solve problems with us. We need to understand what the narratives our audiences walk in with. Next slide. So these are all, and we're going to be dropping some resources, and I'll summarize at the end, things that you can go back to. This is kind of a quick preview of different considerations. So, if we know our audiences, we know our goals, we've done some listening and understanding of polls and other sources of information on, where the narratives are at. We talk about narratives strategy in the sense of trying to move our audience from one set of, beliefs to another set of beliefs. That's the kind of the long game of narrative strategy. Understanding there's a lot underneath that, and it's a long game, not a short game. In most cases, of course, we don't start from scratch. Very few, or maybe no one, has the power alone to kind of shift a serious, widespread narrative. It's something we do together as a cultural process, working together with many kind of trusted voices, gradually kind of chipping away at different perspectives. So part of narrative strategy is to understand this piece of are you creating a brand new narrative where none exists? That's very difficult. Are you trying to undermine an unfavorable narrative and decrease its impact? For example, fortunately right now, David mentioned that, most people aren't blaming clean energy, but there are probably some. Maybe that's your work, is trying to defeat that narrative that clean energy is making energy more expensive. Are you trying to spread a helpful narrative that clean energy is more affordable, for example, or are you trying to do some reframing? For example, working on utility accountability, acknowledging that's a dominant narrative and trying to move it to a place where it's a little bit more helpful, from just kind of frustration with corporate graft to encouraging stronger set of regulations that ensure affordability. Next slide. So putting this together a bit from narrative to story, this is a simple exercise from a race forward worksheet around, understand that those deep values and deep narratives that are at the heart of your work, understand how these stories come together and package in a narrative, then having your preset stories you want to work with, and then delivering them in messages. So this is something you can just take forward and think about for your own campaign. My assumption is that probably in this work, most folks are thinking about this work as kind of either emphasizing some of those positive narratives David pointed to, or actually doing a lot of reframing. So next slide, we're going to go a little bit more into that work of framing, right? Is it a face? Is it a vase? Who knows? Framing is the exercise of essentially drawing boundaries and attention to a way of seeing the world that is helpful for our goals, right? So that is the point. Your narrative is arcing across idea about multiple campaigns and should be durable. And the goal of the frame is, really to help you see what's helpful for your cause. you need to do that by really understanding what the dominant narrative is and how you want to reinterpret it. Do you see a wind turbine as a sign of clean energy and affordable energy, or do you see it as visitable blight, right? And you can potentially see both. Our framing work helps to define that more specifically in people's minds. Next slide. And then, framing gets implemented through strategic messaging, some just basic elements of strategic messaging process. We need to have a goal. We need to be clear on our objectives. It's really hard to move forward if you don't know what you're hoping to achieve in strategic messaging. The narrative work, you can have a broader sense, but ideally you're thinking about that. And then, you need to know who your decision maker are. This is all basic organizers, who your audience is, who can then influence your decision making. That's a lot of communication work, is like trying to move the audiences around the decision makers. And then building out your messages, your media or platforms for delivering, and tactics. So next slide. I think the difficult part right now, as I think David alluded to as well, is like the deep pessimism in that we're experiencing from all corners. And I think Angel just put in the chat some messaging help to think about that from frameworks, which really is about kind of acknowledging that always kind of, and these are basics of all messaging generally, is like starting with a shared value of something that we all can align with together. We all believe everybody should have the opportunity to live a dignified life. Then making the political system more visible, so it's not just this black box of pessimism, but we can see the barriers that are keeping us from that dignified life. Utility shutoffs, the process for folks getting denied access to energy, and how is that process made? Bridging it to people's life, talk about the stories and the real experiences of what it means when someone's power is shut off, particularly to folks that have been historically marginalized or that depend on that energy in a way that others don't. And then offering solutions at the scale of the problem and connecting to action. So these are just some basic general messaging tips, but also there's some background here about how to use these and really tailor them to the reality that there's a lot of pessimism that we don't really believe most politicians in general, and there's a lot of skepticism about ability to make change at this moment. So we need to be attending to that in our messaging. Beyond that, it's in this moment as well, it's really important that the messengers really matter, given the kind of the competition and the attention economy. Folks are looking for that authenticity, right? Because of that distrust. Relatability is really extremely persuasive right now, more than facts and figures, personal stories from people directly impacted, told in their own words, from people they know or have some sense of. And then and then the conversation goes into delivery. And I'll just shout out also, put in the chat, the Solution Project has a recent report that speaks a lot to this kind of messaging question about what's effective and how kind of the messenger is really taking is more important in many ways right now than the actual messages if they're hearing it from the right people, just they're only listening to certain folks. So the last piece of this is really like the delivery once you have your messaging, which we'll go to on the next slide. I'm not going to probably play this given time, but thinking about the media, like what is the right format for your message, the meme, like what's memorable and sticky that will get repeated a lot, and boiling it down, that's a really important part to all this work. The tone, the emotions we want to convey that bring forward the feelings that we think will be supportive, and then the moment, that's like thinking about the timing and the scale and the opportunity windows that open up are really important. So I'll put it in the chat later. This video is just an AI ad, not to repeat some ads. It's a Claude ad. Maybe some of you also saw the premiere during the World Cup, and I noticed it just because it really caught my attention of stopped me. It was effective in terms of tone, and was an example of kind of trying to reframe skepticism of AI by really acknowledging it and listening to the audience, and then kind of playing through a messenger that is all of us. So we'll put that in the chat and listen to it later. And ultimately, this process, right, is about looking for these examples and copying. Like we're audiences for all this work, so being able to pay attention to what we're seeing around us, what's effective in moving us, and learn from that as part of this process. In the last minute here, the last slide or so on the next one is just an example that Just Solutions is working around, which is acknowledging we're in this unique moment of elections are coming up or underway and primaries and such. How do we offer questions and conversation in a nonpartisan way that helps raise narrative questions that will later support strategic messaging? And we've been working around kind of narrative objectives and these deep narratives around kind of dependence and these accountability frames, the broad kind of belief that the system is rigged from left to right, and how do we reframe some of that understanding to messages that can support our strategy. So we're looking at kind of reframes around universal access, right? Personal rights to universal, from corruption to accountability, from the problem is too big to do the big things together. And doing that through stories that speak of people's dignity to pursue the right to livelihood, through stories of fairness as an intentional but not inevitable process, right? How do we get the tech companies to actually pay their fair share in data centers, for example? And through stories of a collective empowerment, how advocates have effectively moved and state legislators to achieve build out this or statewide energy trust as an example from Oregon. We'll leave you behind some of these resources. The next slide is just some different toolkits from different narrative strategists that you can draw on, and all these are great for different purposes, right? And part of the work is just packaging this all together, including the work we just heard from the Environmental Polling Consortium about the specific messages that are resonating right now. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave you with that and pass it back to Brandon so we can have hopefully some time for Q&A.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deric. Really appreciate that. Next slide. So we'll get to Q&A at the end. But next, I just wanted to share a little bit of a case study around using communications and narratives in a campaign, and that was specifically on some work that Just Solutions did in Michigan for an initiative called Michigan Solutions for All, which was about a coalition-driven messaging work from 2024 to 2025. So quick context, Michigan Solutions for All was a partnership between Just Solutions and the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. We coordinated 15 plus community organizations across Detroit, Flint, Saginaw, and then some surrounding high-burn communities. So it was a coalition, not a single campaign, meaning there were a lot of multiple organizations, local contexts, but we were all working under one shared strategy. And that strategy was around making sure folks understood that there was an opportunity for federal investments to be made in Michigan, and how those investments actually didn't mean much unless those who needed them and benefited from them the most were, one, aware, but also able to access them. And so before any of the messaging actually went out, there was a lot of groundwork that we did in the first year for this project that looked a lot like some of the polling aspects, to get at some of the polling aspects that David and EPC talked about. Specifically, we ran about 400 community surveys and 2 focus groups across Detroit and Flint to really understand and find out who the community trusted, what they understood about the investments that were coming down, and how they could benefit from those investments. We were also able to find out who could serve as trusted messengers, people already who were embedded in these communities, what were their thoughts on this, and then how there would even be, what the feeling was about these investments ultimately. In order to get that messaging, we had to, like I mentioned, do some polling, and we ran some digital ads in which folks filled out surveys. And then we also did a lot of just going to community organizations, meetings, and asking folks what they thought. And then ultimately we were able to find messaging that built a campaign around it. So in all, like I mentioned, we were trying to make sure that the investment felt real and tangible, but we also wanted to not necessarily tie it to a policy. We wanted to make sure it was tied to folks' real lives, like their dollars, their paychecks, and things like that. So in order to do that, you really have to make sure you're listening first and understanding the message that will then resonate. Next slide, please. But ultimately, at the end of 2024, something happened, which I'm sure folks are aware, which is the election. So the election happened, and that really required us to pivot, and reframe our narrative that we are working from in 2025. And a lot of this work was led by our state initiative strategist, Crystal Bernard, who really dived in deep to understand kind of what messaging we needed to pivot to and how we could still use the information that we got from the first year in order to build a narrative and a message campaign in the second year that made sense and also allowed for bent up anger or want for accountability, a desire for accountability to be made. And so year one, our messaging, which was informed by research, was primarily, like I mentioned, around awareness building. So we were really talking about like, here's what's available versus year two, we were looking at federal tax on federal investments. So we talked about here's what's under threat and what you can do about it. I think that that's important for folks to recognize, especially given the, what I would say, the context that we're currently living in. There's a lot of state budgets, and especially in blue states, that are rolling back some initiatives related to climate. And so the question becomes, how can you use messaging to really get at accountability, but also the priorities that you're trying to save within that state budget or rollback context? So, for example, in New York, the governor recently rolled back a number of initiatives related to the Climate Leadership and Protection Act up there. That had a lot to do with some just general dishonesty about clean energy deployment, but also a lot around how this would impact people's bills. And the groups that we work with in New York, we didn't specifically work on this campaign, but that we work with in New York, talked about a lot of the need to just not being able, sorry, they talked a lot about not being able to reframe that narrative effectively. So that it gave the governor a lot of political cover to do the rollbacks that were ultimately done. And had they been able to think about like what the reframe would be, they would have been in a much better position, is what we were told. And so a lot of this conversation today is really about like how can you prevent rollbacks happening by reframing narratives effectively and under a strategic communications lens Deric talked about. But as I mentioned specifically in Michigan, we saw that this actually pivot worked and it actually activated a lot of folks. And so next slide. What we saw was there were tangible outcomes that were all about beating abstract policy every time. So basically talking about here's how you can benefit if these rollbacks did not happen, we're better than talking about here's a specific policy that's happening in the state legislature that you can support. That didn't actually fire people up and actually get them to take action and bring them into the coalition, is what we found. There was also messaging that connected investment to affordable energy, clean air opportunities, and job stability that consistently landed better than anything that was specifically related to a funding stream, so a LIHEAP program or something like that, or a policy mechanic specifically. That was really interesting, and that actually held true from year one to year two, is what we noticed. The second thing was that trusted local messengers also mattered way more than any coalition-specific brand. So rather than Just Solutions or MEJC being kind of the face of the campaign, our strategy really focused on putting people who that we identified in earlier phases of the work, really embedding them in and making sure they were trusted by these communities. And then all of the media or all of the earned media or things of that nature that came out from that were from those people ultimately. That was a deliberate kind of tactic and response to what we saw was a really big barrier. And that was just a general distrust of government by these communities. A lot of communities have seen, especially in the Midwest, have seen, the government come in and promise jobs and things of that nature or investment, and then that actually not come to fruition. And so to overcome that barrier of distrust, we really had to think about who would be able to talk about these investments in a way that actually the community wanted to hear from. And you do that by putting your neighbor's name on it ultimately. And that's what we really found was really helpful. Lastly, this wasn't just like a one script that was handed to 15 different organizations. It was coordinated, but it was very locally adapted. So meaning each organization had their own kind of angle, but we were all moving in the same direction of talking about how these how these investments specifically benefited that kind of priority that organization had. So we had some groups that were working specifically on water. We had groups working on solar deployment. We had groups working on weatherization. Each of the messaging or the stories or the messengers that we had focused only on that group's priorities, not necessarily having a writ large a general messaging angle. And what we found was, again, that worked pretty well, and the proof was in the numbers. And so, next slide. So ultimately, we were able to reach about 800,000 Michigan citizens and, well, Michiganders generally, and that generated more than 2.5 million impressions. Those are easy numbers to get, honestly, but I think what matters more is the fact that we had nearly 10,000 advocacy actions taken by Michigan residents in 2025. And those actions look like emailing or calling your legislator, or even county official or state person, state representative, to talk about how these investments were beneficial for folks in Michigan and that they shouldn't go away ultimately. We also had earned media in 5 different counties, including Detroit, the county in Detroit, and then also some up in Saginaw and Flint, which I believe is Saginaw County. I think maybe I'm wrong on that. I'm based in Dallas, Texas, so don't quote me on that by any means. But that was really helpful too, to see local media use a lot of the stories that were happening and write either their own story about it, or they were allowing us to do some op-eds in those counties. We brought in a number of folks who we historically hadn't worked with from rural communities as well. That was really, really impressionable. And I think that's the distinction I want to leave you with, which is like reaching folks isn't necessarily the win, but actually taking action is also really great. And it is something that gets your narrative and your voice out there, but is also allowing you to make progress on the campaigns and priorities that you are ultimately working in. And so a lot of this work, again, wouldn't have been done without our state initiative strategist, Crystal Bernard, but also Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, specifically Latia Leonard. And so just wanted to shout them out because they did a really great job on this work over the course of 2 years. And with that, I'll leave you with opportunity to ask some questions, and we can get some answers from our esteemed panelists who are experts on these topics. Feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat, and we will get you today.
So just a very quick statement that one of the problems we had in New York was not about reframing the message. It was that the governor flat out lied. So I just want to just say that for people who might be following it. But my real question is there any polling or research done that is more about getting progressives to elevate climate to a higher level of interest? Because, I mean, quite frankly, a lot of this research that I've seen seems more focused on non-active people, swing voters, et cetera, which is very important. But one of the problems I think I've seen as a long-term climate activist in New York is that progressives are prioritizing other issues. I totally get that. I respect that. But I think that that's as much a problem as messaging to the general public. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we have been looking at a lot, the Environmental Polling Consortium. There was a time not long ago where climate change was actually up there as a priority for Democratic voters in polls with inflation and the cost of living. Climate change was very consistently a top tier issue for Democrats. That is not the case anymore. It's kind of faded in the last few years. I think we saw a big spike in the 2020 presidential primary when a lot of candidates were elevating climate. We saw a spike because Biden was talking a lot about climate. And I think, when people ask us why kind of everyday Democrats are prioritizing less, we think it's because Democratic elected officials and Democratic candidates are prioritizing it less. And then this creates this feedback loop where candidates don't think the voters care about it, so they don't talk about it. That sends a signal to the voters that it's not as much of a priority. So it's kind of this vicious loop that we're unfortunately in right now, but I do think the path forward is to just get, kind of more courageous leaders talking about it more, because voters very much do take cues from political leaders about which issues are important.
Thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Bob. I want to go to one question that's in the chat that Deric, I think you might be able to help shed some light on. It's from Iowa City, and there's a long comment, but essentially the question is asking, are there guardrails that you would recommend for messaging that avoids further entrenching pessimism that could be counterproductive towards a campaign?
That's helpful. Yeah, good question. I think kind of bridging a little bit the last question and this question as I'm seeing kind of the full thing too. Around kind of like villains and pessimism is really thinking about your audience, right? Like, because partly, that question prior was around what we call the burned out base, right? Which is like folks that have done the work and are feeling kind of frustrated around other stuff and bringing them back. This piece I feel like is related to that, right? Like knowing there's like a certain segments, right, that are really extremely frustrated, and the kind of low-hanging fruit of villainizing, which is kind of maybe a good tactic to draw in, but we also need to kind of build confidence and say regulators to be able to actually take action. So I don't know if it's one thing, but I think it's really just like accounting for that in your model of like, is this an audience who believes in the power of rules, right, and the rule of law, and wants to see a message in a story that really reinforces this. Someone who like got the people breaking the rules to come back into the system, right? That's like an example of that versus an audience segment that's right looking for the hero to break the rules to make the world better. So these are all different kind of story forms that can help reinforce that, but there is this element of picking and trying to choose and maybe experiment in ways that reinforce. And I would just point back to this frameworks piece. Let me see. I think the link we may have dropped was generic. Let me find the specific link that's getting to this question of how we move in this political climate of pessimism.
Appreciate that, Deric. Thank you. And again, we'll be sending out the slides and other links in an email after the fact. So we also have your emails and can get to you if you have any specific questions that we can answer. And then the last question I'm going to look at is from Sharon, which looks at one of our campaigns is utility monopoly of a Southern company focused on energy justice, unfair billing practices, and misdeeds. We have no shame in villainizing and bringing awareness to their bad deeds, but how do you recommend finding the balance? Yeah, I think partially answered that with Deric's question for sure. I would also note too, I think specifically when you're talking about energy justice and unfair billing practices and misdeeds, while a lot of that is accountability from the utility and on the utility, there are policies in place that make that so. And so it's less about the utility being able to do that and more about the legislature or regulator allowing for that to happen, which gets to an angle around like what is the government doing to work for us, which I think is less about a specific entity and more about how you can take on government kind of accountability writ large. In any accountability work, there is going to be a villain, right? But I think you can go about not naming that as clearly if you're working around how to make your government work for you in a more balanced way. That's just one suggestion, and I'm happy to chat with you, Sharon.